The crying began softly, almost like a hum beneath the usual shuffle of feet, and the sound of carrions being lifted into the overhead bins. A few passengers paused, looking toward the back of the plane, where the sound was coming from, but most just kept walking, focused on finding their seat and settling in before takeoff. As always, the window shades were halfway down the air, had that recycled quiet before the storm feel, and the engines outside buzzed faintly in the background. A little girl sat by herself in seat 14, her head down, her face turned toward the window. She had short brown hair, pulled back unevenly with a bright pink scrunchie, and clutched a small stuffed rabbit with one ear nearly falling off her shoulders, shook gently with each sob. But she made no loud noise, just small gasping, sounds like she was trying hard not to be heard. Most people ignored her, some probably assuming her parent was nearby in the bathroom or just seated a row or two away. But as the minutes passed and more passengers boarded, it became clear no one had claimed the seat beside her, and no one seemed to be watching over her. The row remained empty, except for the child, who now pulled her knees up tightly, like she was trying to disappear into the seat. A man in his late 50s, wearing a beige jacket and glasses, noticed her as he walked past, and slowed down for a moment, his brow furrowed, and he gave a small smile. But before he could speak or lean in to ask anything, a flight attendant in a crisp uniform stepped into the aisle with a practiced grin and a clipboard in hand. "Sir, please keep moving to your assigned seat," she said, her voice pleasant but firm. "We need the aisle clear for boarding." The man nodded slowly and kept walking, glancing back once more at the girl. As he found his row, the little girl shifted in her seat, her small voice trembling now as she whispered "Daddy" over and over, her eyes scanning each new face that passed by. One older woman who had just settled into her seat 2 rows ahead turned in concern and looked toward the flight attendant. "Is that child all right?" she asked in a hushed tone. "Does she have a parent with her?" The flight attendant smiled again, this time thinner and more forced. "Everything is under control, ma'am. We are aware, and someone will be along shortly. Please stay seated and enjoy your flight." But there was something in the way she said it, something that didn't sound entirely reassuring. She didn't bend down to talk to the child. She didn't check a name tag or ask a question. She just turned and kept walking. The girl was still crying, now a little louder, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Please come find me, Daddy, please." And somewhere in that plane full of strangers, tension began to rise, not loud, not visible, not spoken, but a quiet kind of worry that settled into the seats, like the weight of something not quite right. The plane was almost full now, rows filling up one by one, the usual pre-flight noises blending together, overhead compartments slamming, soft beeps from seatbelts being clicked in quiet conversations, and the occasional tired sigh from travelers who looked like they had been running all day. But behind all of it, that same small cry continued, soft, then louder, then soft again, like waves that refused to settle, and every now and then that tiny voice saying the same thing over and over, asking for someone who still had not come. A man sitting across the aisle now looked over more directly, watching the girl for a few moments. He seemed unsure, maybe trying to convince himself that someone was just a row away, just out of view. But after a minute, he pressed the call button above his seat. The flight attendant returned the same one with the crisp smile, though this time her face looked tighter, more impatient. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her eyes already darting around, as if hoping he had pressed the button by mistake. "That little girl over there," he said gently. "She seems to be alone, and she's been crying for a while. Is everything okay? Does she have someone with her?" The attendant gave a quick nod, her smile returning, but only for a second. "Everything is fine, sir," she said flatly. "We're aware of the situation, and it's being handled." "Handled," the man repeated softly, more to himself than to her, but he said nothing else, and she turned and walked away again. Another woman sitting diagonally behind the girl tried to catch her attention. "Hi, sweetie. Are you okay? Do you need help?" she asked carefully, but before the girl could answer, the flight attendant came back, moving quicker this time. "Ma'am, we kindly ask that you not speak to unaccompanied minors. It's for their safety and ours." "But she's upset," the woman replied. "She's calling for someone." "It's being taken care of," the attendant said again, her tone sharper. "Now, please return your attention to your seat." The woman nodded reluctantly and sat back, the little girl now wiping her nose on her sleeve and hugging her stuffed rabbit tighter, her face pale, her eyes scanning faces with a mix of hope and fear. And then the overhead speaker crackled as the pilot announced the final call for boarding passengers, and a short delay due to a last-minute gate update. Still no one had arrived to claim the child, and the seat next to her remained empty. People began to whisper, one row at a time, quiet comments exchanged between strangers, some speculating, some expressing concern, some just uncomfortable with the whole thing. Why would anyone put a child on a plane alone? Maybe her parent missed the flight. Where's the airline staff? Shouldn't they be doing more? And yet through it all the crying continued, now a little hoarser, a little more exhausted, and still that single repeated word, "Daddy." And in that moment it felt like the air inside the cabin had shifted just slightly, the warmth gone, the tension spreading like fog, settling into every corner of the plane. The plane was now almost completely boarded, and yet the seat beside the little girl remained empty, her cries softer now, as if she had worn herself out, her voice fading into small gasps that came and went like shallow waves, and for a moment it almost felt like the sound had disappeared. But the silence that followed was heavier, more unsettling. It was the kind of quiet that fills a room when everyone is waiting for someone else to step forward, the kind where people glance around hoping that someone will say something or do something, but no one ever really does. 2 rows behind her, an elderly man who had been watching the whole time finally leaned over to the woman next to him and whispered low enough not to be heard by the crew, "This isn't right. Someone needs to help that child." The woman nodded slowly, her lips pressed together tight, but she said nothing back, just looked forward at the little girl, whose head was now resting against the window, her small hand still gripping that tattered stuffed rabbit like it was the only safe thing left in the world. Another flight attendant, younger and newer by the look of her, stopped briefly near the girl's row and hesitated. She bent slightly as if to speak to the child, but before she could say a word, the senior attendant appeared again, her presence sharp and swift, like a shadow cutting across the aisle. "I told you this is being handled," she said, not to the child, but to the other attendant, her voice low but firm and final. Passengers nearby began to exchange glances again, this time more openly. One man even pulled out his phone and opened the camera slowly, not filming yet, but ready, as if he expected something might happen worth remembering or reporting. The captain's voice returned over the speaker, informing everyone that boarding was now officially closed, and the cabin crew would begin final checks. And still the girl sat alone, no parent, no guardian, no crew member beside her, and no comfort in sight. And then it happened, a moment that shifted the entire energy of the cabin. The little girl suddenly turned in her seat and spoke louder than before, her voice small but clear. "He said he would be here. He said he would come find me." The words cut through the quiet like a bell in a church hallway, sharp and echoing. People turned toward her again, now no longer with curiosity, but with something deeper, something closer to concern or even guilt. "Someone has to ask," one voice said, not loudly but loud enough. "Someone should do something," said another. The flight attendant looked back once more, her smile now gone, completely replaced with a look that was unreadable, not angry, not kind, just blank, like someone who had stopped listening long ago. And still the girl sat there alone in a seat too big for her, in a world too loud for her, calling for a father who had yet to arrive and a kindness that still had not come. The engines began to hum louder, now a signal that the final preparations were underway, and soon the plane would leave the gate. but the girl still sat alone, her back slightly hunched, her small hand reaching toward the aisle, as if hoping anyone would take it. The man with glasses in seat 14C could not sit still anymore. He had been watching too long and saying nothing, and that silence had started to feel heavier than any words he could speak. He unbuckled his seatbelt, slowly stood up, and leaned across the aisle toward the girl. "Sweetheart, do you know where your daddy is?" he asked in the gentlest tone, his voice low and steady. But before the child could answer, the senior flight attendant was there again, her shoes clicking against the aisle floor, her eyes sharp. "Sir, please return to your seat," she said firmly. "We are preparing for departure, and we cannot allow you to speak to that child." "I'm just asking if she's all right," the man replied calmly. The attendant crossed her arms, and her voice got colder. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist." He paused, looked down at the girl, and then back at the attendant, who now seemed more concerned with the rules than the person in front of her. "Does she even have a parent on board?" he asked more loudly, now drawing attention from nearby rows. "That information is not for public discussion, sir. Please take your seat." The cabin fell quiet again, not peaceful, just silent, in that uneasy way where people were too aware of each other, and no one knew what to say next. The girl began to cry again, not loudly, but with a kind of tired sadness, the kind that comes after hope, has started to shrink. Her face pressed against the window, her voice barely more than a whisper as she said his name again and again. Someone in row 15 pulled out their phone and quietly started recording, not out of disrespect, but because something about the moment felt wrong, and they knew someone somewhere would need to see it. The younger flight attendant stood a few feet away, her hands fidgeting by her sides, watching everything unfold with a look that said she wanted to help, but didn't know how or wasn't allowed to. Another passenger leaned into the aisle and asked, "Why hasn't the captain been told about this?" The senior attendant turned slowly, her face tight. "The situation is under control," she said once more, her voice now like ice. But everyone knew it wasn't. It wasn't under control, because a little girl was alone and afraid, and no one with authority seemed to care. And then a chime came over the speaker, the captain requesting that all flight attendants return to their stations and prepare for departure. The plane would be moving soon. And still the girl sat there, eyes red, hands shaking, whispering his name again and again. Still no father. Still no help. Just strangers watching, and a silence that felt far too loud. The overhead speaker crackled again, this time a little more urgent than before, as the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "We are now preparing for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelt is fastened and your seat is upright." The hum of the engines grew louder, the plane beginning to move slowly away from the gate, but the little girl still sat there alone, her eyes wide, and scanning the passengers like she was waiting for anyone to step forward. But no one did. The man in seat 14C sat back in his chair, still watching the child, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't ignore. Should he say something to the crew? Should he demand they stop the plane? Should he get up and comfort the girl himself? But the rules kept him planted in his seat, and the flight attendants kept moving through the aisles doing their job without a care in the world. It felt like an absurd dance of professionalism and apathy. A woman in the row behind the little girl leaned forward, her voice barely audible. "Ma'am, the child has been crying for over 30 minutes. Shouldn't someone check on her?" The senior flight attendant glanced at her sharply before answering in a cold tone, "I've already handled it." But she hadn't handled it. No one had handled it. The child's cries were quieter now, but the ache in her voice was stronger than ever. The words she whispered so faint that only a few passengers nearby could hear them. "Please, Daddy, I need you, please." There was an odd discomfort in the air, now a kind of collective silence that had settled over the plane like a heavy fog, the passengers no longer pretending not to notice the situation. They couldn't ignore it anymore. The flight attendant passed by again, this time her face betraying a hint of impatience. As she caught the gazes of several people, she looked toward the girl and gave a brief, dismissive glance before continuing her rounds. Still no one moved. The plane had begun its slow taxi down the runway, now the lights of the airport shrinking behind them, and yet the little girl still sat alone in her seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit, as if it were the only thing that could protect her. And just as the plane's wheels began to leave the ground, the woman in the aisle seat next to the child leaned over just slightly, not to touch her, but to speak quietly. The girl looked up startled, almost as if she hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge her. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked softly, her voice gentle but urgent. The little girl shook her head, no tears welling up again, as she whispered, "He said he would be here. He said he would come for me." But the words barely had time to sink in before a sudden noise interrupted the tension, a door opening in the front of the plane, a figure stepping in tall and confident, moving through the aisles with purpose and without haste. And then it hit everyone like a wave when they saw who it was. The girl's father, a world-famous actor known for his calm demeanor and his privacy, but also for his deep connection to his daughter. People stared as he moved slowly past them toward the back of the plane, his face serious, his eyes scanning the rows until he found the child who had been waiting so long. The moment he saw her, he smiled, and in an instant the room felt lighter, like something had shifted. The girl looked up, and her face transformed from sorrow to relief. "Daddy," she whispered again, and this time her voice was full of hope. And then he walked to her gently and took her hand. As the man reached the back of the plane, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers, who had been pretending not to notice, now stared openly, some still unsure of what they were seeing. But the man didn't notice the eyes on him. He had only one thing in his focus: the little girl. Her eyes were wide now, but filled with recognition. When she saw him standing there, she opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words were stuck. She couldn't find them. And for a moment it felt like the entire world had paused, like time had frozen just long enough for everything to make sense. Her father knelt in front of her, gently placing a hand on her knee and looking her in the eyes, his voice quiet but full of warmth. "Baby, I'm here. I'm sorry I'm late, but I'm here now." The girl's face crumpled as tears filled her eyes. She reached out to him without hesitation. "Daddy," she whispered, and the tension that had been hanging in the air for so long broke like a dam releasing its flood. Everything fell away, and it was just the two of them now, the father holding his daughter close, and the world fading into the background. Around them the passengers slowly exhaled, as if they had been holding their breath for the entire flight, a few even wiping their own eyes as the scene unfolded before them. The realization settling in that what they had witnessed was something rare, something deeply personal. The senior flight attendant stood frozen in the aisle, staring at the father with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open, like she couldn't quite process the situation. She hadn't known who he was, but now it was clear. The man was a celebrity, someone who had made headlines around the world for his career, but also for his private life, a man who had kept his family out of the public eye for years. And now here he was in this small corner of a crowded plane, holding his daughter, like the world didn't exist beyond the two of them. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances as the reality of the situation hit them. They had been so caught up in the rules, in keeping order, that they had failed to see the bigger picture. The girl's father didn't speak again for a long time. He just held her close, his eyes closed, as if feeling the weight of the moment too, a weight that only parents can truly understand, the responsibility of keeping their children safe and loved. But then, after a long silence, he spoke softly to her. "Sweetie, I'm so sorry. I wasn't here sooner, I promise. I'll never let anything happen to you like that again. You're safe now." The little girl nodded into his chest, her sobs slowing as she calmed down in his arms. "Daddy," she whispered again in the quietest voice, just relieved to have him there with her. And all around them people watched as the scene unfolded, a scene of warmth and love in the middle of a world that sometimes felt too cold, too distant. The plane's engines hummed louder now as they climbed higher into the sky, but for the little girl and her father, everything had changed in that moment. They were no longer two strangers on a plane. They were just a father and daughter, finally reunited. The plane had finally reached cruising altitude, and the engines settled into that steady hum that seemed to lull everyone back into a false sense of normalcy. But in the wake of what had just happened, there was a strange air that hung over the cabin, a heaviness that no one could shake off easily. The father sat back down in the seat beside his daughter, his arms still around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, as if she had forgotten the whole world existed outside that small corner of the plane. No one else said anything. They all just sat quietly, too aware of what had unfolded, but unsure if they had any right to comment. But the senior flight attendant was not quiet. She had been standing near the front of the plane for some time, her gaze never leaving the scene in the back, her face still, pale, like she was processing everything that had just happened. And for a long time she didn't move, she just stood there. Other flight attendants walked past her, giving her side glances, but no one said anything. It was as if they were all waiting for someone to make the next move, but no one did. The man in seat 14C had been watching the entire scene unfold, and now his eyes were fixed on the flight attendant who had first walked past the girl, his expression tense, as he thought back to how she had dismissed the child's cries, how she had ignored the situation, even though something had felt off from the beginning. He'd have been one of the first to notice it, how the child had been alone, how the flight crew had seemed too busy to care, and now, as the father held his daughter, his mind swirled with questions he couldn't shake. Were the rules really that important? Were they worth ignoring the humanity right in front of them? Another woman near the back of the plane leaned over to her seatmate and whispered quietly she was alone. No one should have let that happen. How could they not have noticed? Her seatmate nodded silently, still looking down at his lap, but his face was tense, and there was a visible shift in the way people were now sitting, some turning in their seats, trying to catch one more glance of the father and daughter, others now fidgeting nervously, like the gravity of the situation had finally sunk in. The younger flight attendant walked past them, quickly avoiding eye contact with anyone. She didn't say a word, she just kept moving, but the senior attendant's eyes followed her every step, her gaze colder now, almost like she was blaming her own team for what had happened. As the flight continued, the father and daughter remained mostly to themselves, the girl dozing off in his arms, while he quietly gazed out the window, lost in his own thoughts, perhaps still wondering how this had all gone so wrong. For the passengers on board this flight, nothing would ever feel quite the same. The silence that had once been comfortable now felt thick with regret and confusion. They all knew now that something had been missed, something had been ignored, and in that uncomfortable truth hung a question that no one knew how to answer. Would they ever be able to trust the safety of their children again? And the flight attendants continued their rounds, but now with their heads down, their movements quicker, almost too practiced, as if they were trying to distract themselves from the weight of their own failure. The rest of the flight was mostly quiet now. The earlier tension had dissolved, but the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't the kind of calm that comes with smooth air and steady wings. This silence was heavy. It hung over the cabin like a shadow. It was the kind of quiet that made you think more deeply about things. The little girl had finally fallen asleep in her father's arms, her face peaceful. For the first time in hours, the stuffed rabbit still clutched tightly in her small hand. Her father kept glancing down at her, as if to reassure himself she was really there, that she was safe now. For the passengers around them, the flight continued, but it wasn't the same. Every glance toward the back of the plane now carried a sense of guilt and disbelief. They had witnessed something rare and unsettling, something that left them with more questions than answers. The man from seat 14C, who had noticed the situation first, couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach every time he looked toward the flight attendants, his eyes narrowing as he remembered the way they had acted, as if the child's distress had been an inconvenience rather than a serious concern. He leaned back in his seat again, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't have done anything more, but still the thought gnawed at him. What if he had said something sooner? What if he had stood up earlier? What if he had tried harder to get someone's attention? He shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the plane began its descent into their destination. The smooth glide of the aircraft didn't match the turmoil inside his chest, and he could sense that he wasn't the only one feeling it. A quiet murmur began to spread through the cabin, the kind of whisper that happens when people try to discuss something sensitive, but don't know how to bring it up. No one wanted to confront the awkward truth that everyone had witnessed something wrong, but no one had acted quickly enough. The senior flight attendant, who had been at the center of it all, moved up and down the aisles again, her movements stiff now, her eyes darting nervously. But she said nothing to the passengers. She just walked faster, avoiding eye contact, as if pretending everything was normal would make it go away. Some passengers had put their headphones back in, or tried to focus on their books, but the tension in the air couldn't be ignored. It lingered like a fog. You couldn't see, but you could feel it. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the captain's voice came over the speaker, once more reminding passengers to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. The routine announcements felt empty now, as if the plane had lost something important in the air. The little girl stirred slightly in her father's arms, but didn't wake up, and for a moment the father allowed himself to relax just a little bit longer, his eyes closing, as if trying to hold on to this fleeting peace. But the moment wasn't meant to last. The plane had arrived at the gate, and as the seatbelt signs flickered off, the passengers began to stir and stand up, collecting their things slowly, but no one rushed off the plane, not today. They all stood in quiet reflection, no one really speaking, just moving slowly and thoughtfully, like they were trying to process what they had witnessed and what they hadn't done. The man in seat 14C stood last, his eyes briefly meeting the father's as he passed him in the aisle, a silent understanding passing between them before he finally walked toward the exit of the plane. For the flight attendants, it was clear that something had shifted, something had broken, and although they went through their usual motions, they knew this flight would stay with them for a long time. And as the father and daughter walked off the plane together, no one could stop themselves from watching them disappear into the crowd. No one could forget the little girl's cries or the man's quiet determination to make things right. No one could forget the moment that changed everything.